I don't know if you guys don't know, but I don't care. Like, I don't care, and I think that's with the good stuff like our league does to help with that. If they really do anything, you know, you can put out statements as much as you want, but at the end of the day, you're in an entertainment business. That's when mental toughness comes in. If you're going to live by praise, you're going to die by the hate, and so I think that's on the individual person to have mental toughness. Some people can deal with it, some people can't.
Sophie Cunningham is the most underanalyzed player in the Indiana Fever's story this season. And the reason she has been underanalyzed is that the dominant narrative around the Fever has been so thoroughly organized around Clark that every other player on the roster has been processed primarily as a supporting character in Clark's story rather than as a figure worth examining in their own right. That framing is understandable given the commercial and competitive centrality of Clark's situation. But it misses something important about what Cunningham specifically has been doing and saying this season that makes her analytically significant in ways that go considerably beyond her shooting numbers and her plus-minus. Cunningham has been the player most willing to say the quiet parts out loud, to position herself physically and verbally as the barrier between Clark and the escalating physical environment around her, and to demonstrate through her own competitive conduct what the cultural values of a player who simply refuses to accept that what is happening to her teammate is normal actually look like in practice. She has done all of that while producing some of the most efficient offensive numbers from the bench of any player in the league, recovering from an injury of her own that she handled with exactly zero public drama, and maintaining a public communication style that is simultaneously more direct than anyone else in Indiana's locker room and more emotionally intelligent than the bluntness of her delivery might initially suggest. Today, we are building the complete Sophie Cunningham story this season, examining what her documented public statements and on-court behavior actually reveal about the Fever's internal dynamics, and showing you why she is the most important non-Clark figure in understanding what Indiana is and what it is trying to become. Stay with me, because around the 10-minute mark, I am going to show you something about the specific pattern of when Cunningham speaks publicly and when she stays quiet that reveals a level of situational intelligence that most players with her communication style do not possess. And once you understand that pattern, her contributions to the Fever's public accountability conversation look considerably more deliberate and more consequential than the raw directness of her individual statements suggests. To understand why Cunningham's role in Indiana's story this season is more analytically significant than her position in the coverage suggests, you have to start with understanding what she actually is within the Fever's organizational culture, and what that position gives her access to that no other player on the roster has in quite the same form. Cunningham is not a star player navigating the politics of being the second most important person on a team built around a generational talent. She is something more specific and more interesting than that, which is the player who has made it her specific professional identity to be the person on this team who says the things that need to be said when the diplomatic pressure of the organizational environment makes saying them difficult for anyone with more formal institutional standing to lose. Clark has institutional standing to protect within her organizational relationship with the Fever, which means her public communication has been consistently and carefully calibrated to acknowledge problems without creating the kind of confrontation that would damage the working relationship she depends on to do her job effectively. Stephanie White has even more institutional standing to protect, which means her public communication has been filtered through coaching framework language that acknowledges nothing specifically and deflects everything systematically. The front office and the medical staff have institutional standing of a different kind, but equally constraining in how it shapes what they are willing to put on the public record. Cunningham has less formal institutional standing to lose and more personal standing to gain by being the player willing to say directly what others in the building are feeling but cannot easily say. And she has been exercising that specific freedom throughout this season in ways that have produced some of the most consequential pieces of public accountability documentation in the entire Fever story. The post-game statement Cunningham made following the Thomas incident is the most visible example of her specific public communication role this season, but examining it in isolation misses what makes it significant within the larger pattern of her communication across the full season. What she said after the Thomas incident was direct, specific, and emotionally authentic, in a way that Clark's more carefully measured post-game statement was not, Not because Clark was being dishonest, but because Cunningham occupies a different position in the organizational communication ecosystem that gives her different latitude for different kinds of directness. She did not try to frame the Thomas play as a basketball question, to be evaluated through the lens of competitive standards and officiating consistency. She named it for what it was, in the most basic human terms available, which is something that happened to a person she plays alongside and cares about that she found unacceptable, and she named it without the diplomatic softening that every other official communication around the incident had been carefully including. That specific kind of unfiltered directness serves a different accountability function than the more measured communications from figures with more institutional standing to protect, because it forecloses the reframing strategy that institutional communications typically allow. You cannot reframe Cunningham's post-game statement as a call for better officiating protocols or as a measured assessment of competitive standards. You can only either engage with what she actually said or dismiss it as emotional overreaction from a player who cares too much about her teammate. And the dismissal strategy has a specific and visible cost because Cunningham's credibility as a competitor who plays through pain without complaint and who has never been characterized as someone who manufactures drama makes the emotional overreaction dismissal difficult to deploy against her specifically. Here is the physical dimension of Cunningham's role this season that has received even less analytical attention than her public statements, despite being arguably more consequential in practical terms. Throughout the specific games and specific moments where Clark has been most physically targeted, Cunningham has made a consistent and deliberate choice about where she positions her body relative to her teammate and the opposing players most likely to escalate the physical situation. This is not something she was directed to do by the coaching staff. It is something she has been doing based on her own assessment of what the situation requires and what her specific physical and competitive profile allows her to provide. She has inserted herself between Clark and opposing players during confrontations, accepted the ejection during the June game that cost Indiana her presence for the remainder of the night, and consistently communicated through her body language and her physical positioning that the choice to continue targeting Clark uninhibitedly would have to account for her presence in the situation. That is a specific and rare form of teammate support in professional basketball because it requires accepting real competitive costs, missed minutes, technical fouls, the energy and attention required to maintain physical vigilance in situations where other players would disengage and move on. And it demonstrates a specific commitment to the human relationship with Clark that goes beyond the basketball partnership and into something that actually changes the competitive environment around Clark in ways that no amount of coaching adjustment or league discipline has managed to accomplish. Now here is where the bigger picture makes Cunningham's role more institutionally significant than the team chemistry angle alone would suggest. The Wnba's accountability conversation around what has been happening to Clark this season has been dominated by external voices, by fans, by former players, by NBA figures commenting from outside the institutional structure. The internal voices within the Indiana Fever's organizational ecosystem that have spoken most directly and most specifically about the inadequacy of the institutional response to Clark's situation have been Cunningham's, and that internal origin gives her statements a different kind of institutional weight than the external commentary, however prominent and however credible. When Cunningham says on the record that what Thomas did happens every single game to Clark and the league, and the refs do absolutely nothing about it, she is not making an outsider's observation about a pattern she has read about or watched on television. She is making an insider's observation from inside the 40 feet of floor where those possessions are unfolding, and the insider credibility of that observation is precisely what makes it the most damning single piece of public testimony available about the officiating pattern that the broader accountability conversation has been trying to document through external analysis. The league cannot easily dismiss Cunningham's characterization of the officiating as the overreaction of a fan or the advocacy of an outside commentator with an interest in a particular narrative. She is a player who is on the floor during those possessions, who sees the contact that does and does not get called in real time, and whose specific competitive identity as someone who plays hard and direct and does not manufacture drama gives her characterization of the pattern a specific credibility that statistical analysis from outside the game cannot fully replicate. The injury episode Cunningham navigated this season, and how she handled it relative to how Clark's injury has been managed, reveals something important about the organizational culture the Fever has built around different players, and what that differential treatment communicates about the institution's priorities. Cunningham dealt with her own physical situation this season with essentially zero public drama, no injury reports generating league warnings about transparency failures, no public speculation about whether the organizational characterization of her health matched the observable reality of how she was moving on the floor. She was out, she recovered, she came back, and the whole sequence happened with the kind of quiet competence that professional athlete health management is supposed to look like when the player and the organization are aligned about what the player needs and what the appropriate timeline for her return looks like. The contrast between that quiet and effective management of Cunningham's situation and the documented cascading failures in how Clark's situation was managed is not primarily a story about different levels of medical sophistication applied to different injuries. It is a story about which player's organizational relationship allowed for the kind of transparent and patient health management that the sports medicine literature identifies as best practice, and which player's organizational relationship introduced the commercial and competitive pressures that produced the reactive and inadequate management the Clark injury cascade documents. Remember the pattern of when Cunningham speaks and when she stays quiet that I mentioned at the opening? We are getting to that now, because it reveals a level of situational intelligence that makes her specific public contributions to the accountability conversation considerably more deliberate than the raw directness of her communication style might suggest. Here is what nobody covering Cunningham's role this season has mapped carefully enough. When you track the specific timing of every significant public statement Cunningham has made this season and compare it against the organizational communication environment in which each statement was made, a very consistent pattern emerges. She speaks specifically and directly at exactly the moments when the organizational communication around the situation has been most diplomatically managed, and therefore most in need of a voice that names what everyone involved already knows, rather than what the institutional language is capable of acknowledging. She stays quiet at the moments when the organizational communication is producing something adequate, and when her adding to it would create additional institutional friction without producing corresponding additional accountability value. That pattern of speaking selectively when speaking adds something that the available official communication cannot provide, is not the communication strategy of a player who simply says whatever she thinks whenever she thinks it. It is the communication strategy of a player who has developed a sophisticated understanding of when the organizational communication environment needs her specific kind of contribution and when it does not, and who deploys her considerable willingness to be direct, specifically in the moments where directness serves the accountability function rather than simply generating drama. The second dimension worth examining here is what Cunningham's specific relationship with Clark communicates about the internal culture of the Fever's locker room that the official organizational communications have been unable to produce. Professional teammate relationships in the Wnba are not uniformly close or uniformly demonstrative of genuine personal regard, and the specific way Cunningham talks about Clark in post-game settings, with the combination of pride and protectiveness and honest assessment that characterizes her public references to her teammate, suggests a genuine personal investment in Clark's well-being that goes beyond the normal vocabulary of professional basketball partnership. Here is my verdict on Sophie Cunningham's significance to the Indiana Fever's story this season, stated as directly as her own communication style deserves. Sophie Cunningham is the player who has most completely and most effectively occupied the specific accountability role that the Indiana Fever's organizational communication structure has made both necessary and difficult for any other figure within the institution to occupy. And she has occupied it with a combination of competitive credibility, personal authenticity, and situational intelligence that makes her public contributions to this season's accountability conversation considerably more consequential than the secondary billing she receives in a Clark-dominated narrative allows. The first reason this verdict matters is that the specific insider testimony she has provided about the officiating pattern and the physical environment around Clark is the most credible available evidence of exactly those things, because it comes from inside the 40 feet of floor where they are happening, rather than from statistical analysis outside it. The second reason is that her physical positioning as the barrier between Clark and the escalating competitive environment has had practical effects on that environment that coaching adjustments and league discipline have not produced, because her willingness to accept real competitive costs in service of that positioning communicates consequences for targeting Clark that are immediate and certain in a way that disciplinary processes that happen days after the fact cannot replicate. The third reason is that her communication pattern, deploying directness specifically when directness serves the accountability function rather than randomly throughout the season, demonstrates a situational intelligence that makes her specific contributions to the public record considerably more deliberate and therefore more analytically significant than the surface impression of a player who simply speaks her mind without strategic filtering. The strongest counter-argument is that Cunningham's role, while genuine and valuable, is ultimately a supporting function in Clark's story rather than an independent narrative, and that the significance I am attributing to her specific contributions overstates the degree to which any teammate's behavior changes the fundamental institutional dynamics of the accountability situation. That is a fair structural observation about the limits of what any single teammate's contribution can accomplish within an institutional accountability problem of the scale this season has documented. But the counter-argument underestimates the specific value of the insider credibility Cunningham's testimony provides, and the practical value of the competitive environment changes her physical positioning has produced, both of which are contributions that nobody else in the organizational ecosystem is positioned to provide in the same form. Tell me in the comments whether you think Sophie Cunningham has been the most important secondary figure in the Indiana Fever's story this season, yes or no? And tell me specifically what you think her contributions have changed about either the accountability conversation or the competitive environment around Clark that would have been different if she were not there. 3 specific and trackable predictions about Cunningham's role going forward. First prediction: high confidence. Cunningham's public communication in the final stretch of this season continues to be selectively deployed at exactly the moments when the organizational communication environment is most in need of her specific kind of directness. And at least one more specific and consequential public statement from her lands in the accountability conversation before the season ends, in a way that produces the kind of immediate and specific public record that her previous statements have produced. The pattern of selective strategic directness is too consistent to be accidental and too valuable to the accountability function for her to stop deploying it before the season's major institutional questions are resolved. Second prediction: medium confidence. Cunningham's specific value to the Indiana Fever organization is formally recognized in an organizational communication or a contractual context before the end of the current year, in a way that reflects the Fever's understanding that her specific role in the team's competitive and cultural identity this season has been more consequential than a bench player's contributions are typically acknowledged to be. That recognition, if it comes in the right form, will tell you that the organization has processed what she has been doing at the level of strategic and cultural value, rather than purely at the level of offensive production off the bench. Third prediction: the risky one. Low confidence but analytically interesting. Cunningham becomes a figure whose public communication about the Clark situation and the broader Wnba accountability questions this season raises is cited as a reference point in how journalists and analysts covering the league evaluate the role that individual player voices can play in producing accountability outcomes that institutional and external communications have failed to generate. Because the specific combination of insider credibility, strategic deployment, and competitive authenticity she has demonstrated this season provides a genuinely useful model for how player accountability communication can work most effectively in professional sports contexts, where institutional communication consistently falls short. Watch Cunningham's next significant public availability for any continuation of the selective directness pattern, specifically looking for whether she speaks with the same level of specificity about the competitive environment around Clark that her previous statements have provided, or whether the improved team performance following Clark's return has reduced the specific accountability pressure that has been driving the most direct elements of her public communication. Also watch whether her physical positioning relative to Clark in competitive situations during the remainder of the season maintains the specific barrier posture she has been adopting, or whether the reduction in targeted physical attention Clark receives following the Thomas suspension changes the environment enough that the barrier posture becomes unnecessary. My next video is going to examine the complete picture of the Indiana Fever's internal culture, as it can be read from the documented public statements and observable behaviors of every player on the roster this season, building a comprehensive account of what the team actually looks like from the inside, based on what its own members have put on the record, in the moments when the organizational communication framework has allowed for honesty rather than requiring the diplomatic management that official communications typically apply. The single most important takeaway from everything in this video is this: Sophie Cunningham has occupied a specific and necessary accountability role within the Indiana Fever's organizational ecosystem this season that no other figure within the institution has been positioned to occupy in the same form, deploying insider credibility, competitive authenticity, and strategic situational intelligence to produce public accountability contributions that have been more consequential for the broader Clark story than the secondary billing she receives in a Clark-dominated narrative has acknowledged. And the full Sophie Cunningham story this season deserves to be examined and understood as its own analytically significant narrative, rather than purely as a supporting chapter in Clark's. Subscribe right now if you want daily coverage that treats every significant figure in the Indiana Fever's story with the analytical depth their specific contributions deserve. Because the complete picture of what this team is, and what this season has meant, requires understanding everyone in the building, rather than just the one whose name is on every headline. And before you go, leave me one comment. What specific thing has Sophie Cunningham done this season that you think has had the most practical impact on the competitive environment around Clark, or on the public accountability conversation about Clark's situation? And tell me specifically why you think that particular contribution has mattered more than any other single thing she has done.